So good to be here to join all of you to talk about this most essential piece of our identity as Americans. It's freedom. I want to start with a quote by Harry Truman that I think is perfect for this moment as a great reminder of our founder's vision. He said, "America was not built on fear. America was built on courage, imagination, and an unbeatable determination to do the job at hand." When we think back to those powerful words and look at the country, the society, the climate, and the culture that we're living in right now, this culture of fear that is so pervasive, we see how far off we've gotten from that unbeatable spirit. I served in Congress for 8 years and ran for president in 2020 in the Democratic primary. And while we like to have this idea that we have great, courageous leaders in Washington who are selfless and proactive and who have foresight, who are looking around the next corners, seeking how do we solve the problems not just of today, but for tomorrow, set us up for success. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We know. Unfortunately, on a day-to-day basis, we are surrounded by leaders who are driven solely by fear. Fear of being canceled, fear of being criticized, fear of being unpopular is one of the first things that I experienced and was kind of eye-opening for me when I was elected to Congress back in 2012 was within the first few days on the floor of the House of Representatives, I saw how much Congress is like high school. We had different cliques. The cool kids were here, the nerdy kids were here, the jocks were there. The outcasts were sitting by themselves. No one wanted to be caught on C-SPAN sitting next to them. People were concerned about, well, if I hang out with you, I might not get invited to this cool party. I'm not exaggerating. These are the things that are on the top of people's minds as they're making decisions that affect us today and in the future. Ultimately, they're driven by a fear of losing power and losing control. And at the heart of it, they're afraid of us. They're afraid of a free society of free-thinking individuals, people who have the ability to be critical thinkers and make our own decisions for ourselves and to live with the consequences of those decisions. And that right there, that freedom, is the casualty of this culture of fear that exists within our leaders. It's one of the reasons why I left the Democratic Party a few months ago, because so it sounds like you might agree with some of my reasoning. The party that I joined 20 years ago, back in Hawaii, the party of JFK and MLK, this big tent Democratic Party that actually welcomed people with different ideas, encouraged vigorous debate, encouraged individual liberties and free thinkers, it's unrecognizable today. Instead, we have this elitist cabal that is made up of leaders in the Biden administration, those in Congress, we have permanent Washington, the mainstream media, big tech, the national security state, all working together, driven by this singular, insatiable desire for power. And in that quest, they do not tolerate dissent. They do not tolerate those who dare to challenge or even question their narrative or their decisions or what they deem is the cause of the day. They demand compliance and they expect us to fall in and lock step. If you don't, there are consequences. They try to smear and silence and ruin anyone who dares to challenge their power. I know you heard from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. earlier. He knows a little something about this. I know a little bit of something about this. They make an example of those of us who dare to speak the truth and call out what is common sense and obvious to the rest of us about their insanity and hypocrisy, hoping that by making an example of us, they will then cause the rest of us to self-censor ourselves, to fall in line and to comply. The courageous FBI whistleblowers that we saw testifying before Congress today, they know a little bit about those consequences. They deserve our support to continue to speak the truth, and they will inspire others to do the same. But some of the tools that they're using, that this elitist cabal is using, is weaponizing our federal agencies and law enforcement to go after their political opponents. The Durham report that was just released exposed this in broad daylight, how the Russia collusion was a manufactured hoax and the FBI was weaponized to use that to undermine Donald Trump's candidacy and presidency. We saw how the corporate media, they are more than willing to parrot the talking points that they are given to support this narrative. We are seeing more and more, as evidence comes out, how those 51 former senior intelligence officials worked very closely with the media, worked closely with employees of the CIA to stop voters from seeing the information on Hunter Biden's laptop in the weeks leading up to that election. Why? Why did they go through all of this effort to do that? Because they knew that if we saw the truth, we might make a different decision. The ironic hypocrisy in all of this is they did it in the name of protecting us, we the people, from being exposed to misinformation and disinformation. But in doing so, they were spreading disinformation to try to manipulate us and to steal our democracy. Now, unfortunately, they are also working hand in glove with many of the big tech monopolies who have no problem following explicit or implicit orders coming from the White House or these law enforcement agencies to silence political opposition, to cancel accounts, and manipulate search engine results to influence what information we as voters are exposed to. So these major tools and weapons that they are using against us are actually what is undermining our democracy. The Biden administration's move towards implementing a central bank digital currency is their latest effort towards exerting control and taking away our freedom. No matter how many flowery words they use to deny that there is ill intent or that they will invade our privacy or try to control how we spend our money, no matter how many times they say, hey, this is for your own good. How many times have we heard that before? Too many. And it's usually followed by something really bad. They're telling us this is for your own good. This is to make your life easier. This is going to make things more convenient for you. But ultimately, we know this is about their insatiable desire and mission for total control. They want to be able to surveil every aspect of our lives, to be able to take note of every purchase that we make, small or large. And in doing so, by having this power, they say they would never use it, but they would have the power to be able to control what we buy, how much of it, what we are not allowed to buy, or ultimately freezing our accounts. The fact that we are so limited already in our ability to use cash is evidence of where this path leads. The fact that we are seeing what's happening in Europe with France and Italy, you spend over €1,000 in France, you are suspect and possibly could be investigated. It's not an imagination about where this road heads. Once we give up our economic autonomy, we give up our freedom. Once we allow someone else to control our wallet, they control our freedom. And that's why when you look at any conversation in Washington around Bitcoin, the first thing you recognize is most of them don't even know what they're talking about. Bitcoin is a word, people use it, what does it mean? Nobody really knows. But they know enough to know that they shouldn't like it because it will undermine their ability to control us. And that's why we're seeing the opposition that we see. So as much as they claim often to care for the downtrodden, to care for those who are living in oppressed countries, those who are economically oppressed, those who are minorities without the opportunities that many others have, and therefore you would think they would be interested in how Bitcoin is transforming the lives of people around the world, but they don't actually care about people. Their desire for power and control trumps everything else, which is why they are leaning so hard into implementing more and more authoritarian-style policies here at home. Their arrogance and selfishness knows no bounds. We see it reflected in our domestic policy and in our foreign policy. This cabal of the most powerful institutions in our country, for a long time trying to keep up a facade of democracy here at home, trying to keep up a facade of democracy. We support democracies around the world, but when it comes right down to it, it's all a lie. Their actions tell a very different story. We're seeing now, as we head into this consequential presidential election next year, their arrogance is pushing them to be even more blatant, saying, you know what, we're not even going to try to hide it anymore. We actually don't respect voters. We don't care for you to be able to hear from every candidate who's running for president. We're just going to cancel the Democratic primary debates altogether. And we're going to rig the election so that New Hampshire is no longer first in the nation, but South Carolina is, because we know Joe Biden's going to win in South Carolina. So when people talk about influencing elections, the things that we're talking about here today are those things about how our democracy is being manipulated, not for the benefit of the people, but for the benefit of the control of those in power. And just like they are doing this for us here at home, where they have no respect for anyone who dares to challenge them, challenge our government's policies, they see those of us who oppose these policies as the enemy. So too, as they look to other countries, if you fail to kowtow to the wishes of the American government, whether it's good for your country or not, they will also label you as the enemy. They don't care about the well-being of the American people. They don't care about the prospects for peace. They don't care about our national security. It is about power and control. We cannot have a thriving democracy if we don't have freedom of speech. We cannot have a thriving democracy if we don't have an active, free press with journalists who have the courage to tell the truth. And we don't have an active democracy when our own institutions that exist for the sole purpose of serving the people of this country are actually being weaponized against us. So when you hear people in power talk about threats to our democracy, the threat to our democracy is not coming from some foreign country. Those are distraction tactics that they are using to get us to not pay attention to what they are doing every single day to us and our democracy and our freedom right here at home. They are dragging us, towards this darkness of these authoritarian-style policies and away from this beacon of light that our founders envisioned this country would be, and embodying and striving towards a more free society and a free people. Thomas Jefferson talked about these cowardly leaders when he said, quote, "They prefer the calm of despotism to the boisterous sea of liberty." Our choice, our responsibility, as we look to this bleak, dark landscape that we live in, we find hope in recognizing that there's a reason the founders chose the words, "we the people." There's a reason why they spoke of a self-governed nation. Our voices, our votes, our daily choice to exercise our own freedoms is the best way to fight against this oppression. It's the best way to fight against those who seek to take our freedoms away. We are the ones who must act to stop these actions coming from those in power. We are the ones who must act to defend and protect our freedoms for us today and to defend this country that we love. Thank you so much. Aloha.
So we heard a lot in that talk by Tulsi Gabbard about politics. Anthony, you spent a little bit of time down in the swamp. She called it a high school. Is that what you saw when you were down there?
Well, I was saying this the other night. I had a couple of government officials at the SALT conference. I was in the Oval Office with Trump. It was a Wednesday. You know how I know that? because I was only there for one Wednesday. I got fired shortly thereafter, but there I was. And Mr. Trump said something I'll never forget. He said, "Hey, man, I thought I was a killer. I was in the real estate industry in New York. I thought all these guys were killers." He goes, "The secretaries down here, the assistants, they'll stab your eyeballs out." and the point being is that it is so out of control, it is so lawless, and it is so cynical. And lest anybody forget, there's $37 billion of lobbying and lawyer money being spent on 535 people in that Congress. So just imagine the processes that go on there to curry favor with those legislatures.
And now, Bill, what I heard from her was a lot about control, a lot about systems that would oppress people. And it contrasted so perfectly with your talk with Michael Saylor earlier today, because what I got out of that was that shining light of freedom that she alluded to. So is that what you're seeing out there? Is it really that obvious? Is this contrast of what's going on down there, having someone who it's kind of laughable to say is the leader of the free world now, right? It doesn't look that way.
Well, what's really interesting about Bitcoin is that it removes the human element of judgment around the decision making with regard to money. And Anthony is talking about what a cesspool it is and all these people going back and forth. When you remove the human element from the monetary function, a lot of good things can happen.
And speaking of the human element, she gave some pretty wise advice about personal sovereignty, personal control of your decisions. Zuby, you've inspired a lot of people to not follow. I think one of the big things you brought to this world is just showing people you can be yourself. You set an example out there. Is that something that sticks out when you hear politicians now finally saying, don't stick in line, be your own person?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone needs to hear that message. I mean, being here in the USA, I mean, I'm from the UK myself, but supposedly this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? This is the bastion of liberty in not just the Western world, but the entire Western world, in the entire world, right? And if people here are afraid to speak their mind or afraid to be authentic, afraid to be their own individual selves, then what hope does the rest of the world really have? So I think it's fantastic to hear her speak on that. I know she was speaking about it when she was still a congresswoman working in DC, but I think that now she's more of a free agent. She can speak a lot more passionately on these issues, and I wish that more people would do so.
Now, let's turn our attention just a little bit of predicting here. It looks like the stars are aligning to show that Bitcoin is going to be the #1 subject around the 2024 election. We've seen everyone who's pitching in for this, every single person vying for candidacy is talking about either CBDCs or Bitcoin. And everyone in Bitcoin knows the timing of the halving seems to be right around the election. So do you guys predict the same thing that I'm seeing, that Bitcoin is actually going to be a ballot question in 2024?
I might even take it a step farther. I think Bitcoin could be the basis for a new political party within the next 5 to 10 years, just because the concept of money is so important and how we govern it. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. And people have a hard time conceptualizing of the possibilities that could come from that. And so as those start to materialize, you're going to see more and more people mobilizing around that idea.
Well, we're going to hear one of the reasons for which they might be mobilized, which is a crisis in confidence. We've got Michael Lewis and Arthur Hayes coming up next on the Nakamoto stage on that very subject, contrasting the confidence we have in the fiat banking system and Bitcoin. Back to the Nakamoto stage here at Bitcoin 2023 in Miami.